Hello, my name is Spencer Hay. I'm the co-founder and chief science officer at Prism Bio, and this is Discussing Data Science. My guest today is Dr. Mustafaraj. Eni is an associate professor of computer science at Wellesley College. She has taught courses on a variety of topics in computer science, including artificial intelligence, data analytics and visualization, data and text mining, and many others. She's also one of the co-founders of the data science program at Wellesley. In her research, she is focused on web-based social technical systems and is particularly interested in understanding bias and credibility in online information sources. So Eni, thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Spencer. It's such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you. So what I'd like to perhaps start with is I'd love to hear you perhaps define and then say a little bit more about what you mean about social technical systems. Like, what are those in your understanding?
Well, so let me start with an example. Think of the transportation system, right? We take the car every day, or the train, or the bus. And that's an example of a socio-technical system because, of course, there are technologies like cars and trains and buses. There is the infrastructure, the roads, the railways, bridges. And of course, it's us humans. We are driving these vehicles, but we are also designing the infrastructure. We are designing the institutions, the rules, organization, etc. So it's a complex socio-technical system. Mm-hmm. And we have many of such systems out there in our societies. But then in the past decades, we have been building this online socio-technical systems, and one of the biggest one out there is the internet or / the web, right? It depends. They are connected to one another. In a sense, the internet is like the physical infrastructure, the technologies, and the web is the combination of both the software that runs on top of the internet, but also of everything else that we humans have created in order to communicate with one another. So yeah, and it's an interesting, ever-evolving system. And just like we are trying to understand and design better socio-technical system in our society, researchers and scientists are trying to do the same with the web.
Maybe then to drill into that a little bit, so you're particularly interested in kind of the web-based systems, right? And I know you've done a lot of work sort of exploring in particular like Google's search results and kind of how those work and how it sort of informs people's, I guess, I know I want to say opinions, but maybe it's not just opinions. It's like even kind of their whole perspective on the world. But please, like, can you tell us more about sort of your work there?
Right. So when we think about the web, the web plays several roles, right? One is, in a sense, a communication technology, right? Especially the social web when we think of social media and social network, but it's also an information environment where we go whenever we have information needs from, now in our language, we use the word Google. Mm-hmm. Why don't you Google it? It's common part of our vocabulary. And so then it's important what kind of information we find on the web, especially because this search process is mediated through the search engine algorithms. So then I hope that we all care about the online information environment. We care about the kind of information that we find there. And we care about things like, is it harmful or is it truthful? Or what are the sources that are producing this information? And so we need mechanisms and processes in order to observe and monitor what's happening in this information environment in which Google is such an important actor because it's basically our getaway to getting to this information. Mm-hmm. And so my goal and part of my research now for many, many years, because I started doing this in 2008, has been the word for this is auditing search results, especially in the context of political elections, but also, important events such as Supreme Court cases, etc., in order to look at both what Google is doing, but also what the other actors in this information environment are doing. How are they behaving? How are they adjusting to now these algorithmically curated environment? Because you can learn a lot just by looking at how Google is actually organizing the search result page. If you're searching for something like COVID, you all might remember in the past months and years when we were searching for COVID, actually there was an entire dashboard on Google search where you could see all kinds of statistics and national news and local news, and then information from our health authorities, etc. Just because it was such a big event, right? And similarly, during the elections, you see that change. And over time, since the web is composed of thousands and thousands of online news sources or other information sources, all of them also learn to adjust to this algorithmic environment, trying to make themselves legible to the algorithms, trying to make themselves so that their content is showing up in the top, right? So there is an entire search engine optimization industry that caters to various online sources, helping them, to get at the top of the search results. And these are things that we want to be able to capture. So the process that we do this is through this auditing, which is basically like a large scale, but also longitudinal search in Google, where, for example, in one of the studies that we did a couple of years ago, we collected data for an entire year for everybody who was a candidate during the presidential election primaries for Democrats and Republicans, in order to see sort of what was going on in the information environment. And as I said, you learn a lot about what Google's algorithms prefer in terms of which news sources, what topics, etc.
Fascinating. So, Lado, can you let us in on some of the things that you learned, like particularly maybe with respect to like bias, right? Or I don't know, maybe I don't want to bias the question. What's one of the kind of more interesting things that you learned in this process?
Right. So there are a couple of things that we have learned, and the interesting thing about this is that it's not only my research group that has been doing this. There are a couple of other research groups who are working in this topic. And so we all have confirmed each other's findings, which is the natural thing to do in science. So that's great. So one of the major finding is something called source concentration. So it turns out that actually Google relies on certain news sources and shows them much more often than others. And these are the mainstream sources like NPR, New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, NBC, right? Now, of course, it is also the case that these are the biggest news organizations out there. And so they have a large volume of content that they are producing. But even when their content is stale, let's say like from 3 years ago and 3 months ago, etc., Google then still will show you these sources ahead of other sources, right? So that is one finding. Another finding is that it turns out that like the news ecosystem is indeed varied in the sense that there are thousands of sources there. And some researchers have come up with ways to assign political orientation to these sources. And if you look at the distribution of the political orientation of these news sources, which we did in one of our papers, it's actually pretty normal, right? Like you see that most of the news sources are either center left or center right, and then they are, the tails for far left and far right. But the fascinating thing is that not all these news sources produce news at the same rate. And especially it depends also on the topic. So even though there are so many sources that are mostly like center right, meaning something like Wall Street Journal, for example, would be sort of center right. Actually, they don't produce as much content. There has been these effect where, they are disappearing because people, when they want to read about like right-leaning perspective, actually go to sources such as Fox News, which is further right. And so then when you look at the distribution of the news content and news article, then you have sort of this more bimodal distribution, right? You have slightly left of center because things like New York Times and Washington Post and NBC maybe are, slightly left of center, but then you have this other bump where Fox News and the Daily Caller or Breitbart are. And what was fascinating was when we collected data about Trump and Biden. Basically, most of the content about Trump was being created by the center-left sources, which are the mainstream sources. But actually, most of the content about Biden was coming from, and this was in 2019, so Biden was still just the Democratic candidate, right? It was coming from places like Breitbart and Fox News because they were out there trying to create the narrative around Biden as somebody who was elderly and probably not the right choice, etc. So, but it's fascinating to see that in the data in terms of the news that was being produced.
If you put yourself, let's say, in Google's seat, right? Like, I don't know. I mean, like, how do you think about that? So like, you're the, they're the search engine, right? Like, they could read your results. Hopefully they have looked at your results and are like, okay, so we sort of have this distribution of news sources, but it's like the producers, and it seems like the audience is kind of bimodal versus kind of the normal, right? Is there something that if you are the search engine, you might want to do there? Do they have an obligation to do something in your view?
Yeah. So, I mean, first of all, there is Google is trying to do the right thing by basically sampling from a large,
I see, interesting,
and diverse variety.
So they're trying to sample from the normal, basically, when they're giving you the information.
Yes, right. Because basically, first we look at, we collected all this data and we said, let us just look at the distribution of the sources, not of what they are producing, but of the sources. And that is like a perfect normal distribution, right? It's so balanced. And you say like, oh yeah, it looks like there is some intentionality here, right? Like Google, it's trying to do its best. However, Google cannot control how much they are producing content and also what kind of content they are producing. Now, we have to think here that this is at the backdrop of the the news industry basically going downwards for years now, right? And also, I mean, the concentration of sources is also something that we see right now. Everybody goes to New York Times, for example, or CNN, and most local and regional newspapers don't have the resources to compete in an ecosystem where, some of the players are really, really powerful. And so Google is trying to do the right thing, but doesn't have control. Also, on the other hand, Google and Facebook, by controlling the advertising industry, online advertising industry, in a sense, where the reasons why local and regional, or one of the reasons that local and regional journalism basically is in decline because they lost the advertising revenue that was going to them. So Google is trying to do that, but in a sense, it's also trying to monitor if there are actors out there that are trying to abuse basically this prime time slot that Google is providing for them. Because one thing to keep in mind, when you go to Google nowadays, top stories, right, like news is actually, especially for things that are currently in the news, that is the first thing that you see there. And that is what we were looking at, not scrolling down and seeing sort of stale content, but basically what is the freshest news about something. And it turns out that, outlets like Breitbart had really learned this about Google. And so they were either updating their stories or just keep repeating the same story in order to remain fresh, but of course, very biased toward their perspective. And so over time, I think Google was able to see that, some of the actors really are not there to provide news, but just certain opinions. So over time, it actually restricted the number of news sources that was being shown. And it's so interesting because in our data, we can see the point in which sort of Breitbart disappears because Google made the decision that, it shouldn't be one of the news sources that we should show as a top story. However, though, often these decisions are not very transparent, right? Like it took Breitbart itself a couple of weeks and the help of a search engine optimization company to figure out that, we are not showing now any longer in search results for things like Biden and Trump, etc. It is a challenging task to have, also because you might remember during the Trump years, there was a lot of pushback toward the big platforms, and they were being constantly labeled as left-leaning or anti-conservative, when the reality was not that, right? Like often one of the most shown news sources is like Fox News or the New York Post, because Google is trying constantly to have a balance and in terms of what news sources is showing. And in fact, we theorized in one of the papers that it looks like Google very much is trying to bring back the fairness doctrine, which is something that was the law of land for almost 40 years in the news industry, where you basically by law were you required to fairly represent various viewpoints. And that is what the algorithms of Google have been trying to do, right? Every time that you get some stories, Google is trying to balance sort of sources from a variety of political perspectives.
I can understand kind of in the realm of politics, like there's a certain amount of whatever you want to call it, opinion or principle, right? That's kind of like, well, look, there really are just kind of different views, right? And you might think for a healthy kind of political environment, you want to have those views, they at least have their opportunity to kind of express themselves, right? But there's also then the next layer, which I know right? There's like, well, but then there's the kind of layer of like the truth, like facts about the world, right? Where it's not really, there shouldn't be multiple opinions, right? It's really kind of, well, there's a state of things, and that is, just what it is. And it seems like that shouldn't matter what news source you're going to. Now, of course, we know that it does in certain realms, but like, I don't know, like how do you think about that in this space? So like Google is trying to kind of, if they're trying to sample from these different sources, right? as people are Googling questions, right? If people are Googling things that, so maybe to tie it back to like you were talking about earlier, like kind of COVID information, right? People are Googling about COVID vaccines, right? If you are the search engine, are you like, okay, well, we want to sample from a variety of sources across the political spectrum to answer this question? Like, does that make sense?
No, that's a great point, right? But and for COVID, Google and all the other platforms, once they saw the severity of it, I mean, try to label everything by saying, like, the first notification there would be like, go to CDC, right? It was on YouTube, you still have it, right? Whenever you search for a COVID related thing, all the videos have underneath like, oh, for the latest news and information, go to CDC. And Google was trying to do the same. So I mean, it was showing, news from all the sources that were creating news, but the way it's ranked is that basically some of these sources are just prioritized more.
Yeah.
So if New York Times is constantly writing about COVID, which New York Times was doing, then you would always see New York Times and CNN and Fox News. Yeah. Basically, in the moment that something it's really important, you can be sure that the big news organization are covering. So it's easy for Google because these news outlets have the highest ranking. So they will always show first, and occasionally Google will show some other sources. But if something it's big news, the chances that you see other sources is small. And because Google learned its lesson a couple of years ago, you might remember, I think it probably was around 2016 where there was, after the election, and then there was this idea of the popular vote, who won the popular vote, et cetera. Right. And Trump didn't win the popular vote, Clinton won it, but at some point people searched, or a journalist searched, like, oh, who won the popular vote? And like a completely random blog came saying like, oh yeah, Trump won the popular vote, etc. Or I think the question probably was, did Trump win the popular vote?
Yeah.
And it got so much press because you also have to remember that 2016 and fake news, right, is like where the entire news media woke up to the power of Facebook and Google and said like, wait a second, right? Like what these companies are doing seems so important. We have to keep an eye on them. And so journalists are constantly keeping an eye on what Google and Facebook, et cetera, are doing. And so they learned the lesson. And so they kind of started being very careful about which news organizations are in that list, right? And so then to go back to your question, mostly these are news organizations that they might have a political bias, but generally are committed to truth, whatever they define as truth. So basically, these are not completely unreliable news sources. They just have their political slant towards certain events, right? And we know that often is very problematic, but these are not news sources that are completely straight out lies, etc.
Why don't we transition to talking about ChatGPT? So new large language model, chatbot, this is all the rage. Would love to get your perspective on sort of what are some of the things that I guess excite you or really interest you about the new technology? What are some things that you feel like people misunderstand about it? Would love the professor's take, if you would.
I mean, there are a few things to say there. First is that ChatGPT, it's a remarkable achievement of computer science. Like people often don't understand why people would, create these tools. But something to think about is that all computer scientists, when they go through their computer science education, learn about things like the Turing test. And, everybody who studies computer science and takes a theory class in computer science, they learn about Alan Turing, which is the father of the modern computer science, his Turing machine, and then Turing test. The Turing test is, it's about can machines things, right? It's a fascinating problem in computer science, and artificial intelligence, et cetera, as a branch of computer science has been working on this question for decades now. And now suddenly we have a technology that not only can pass a Turing test, right, but they can do amazing things that until a few weeks ago or months ago, we thought like, oh, only humans can do these things, right? Yeah. So in that sense, it's really remarkable and fascinating. However, it's happening in the context in which we are past, computer science is just like an intellectual exercise, right? It's not, right? Yeah. In the past 20 years, it has become really clear that it's one of the most powerful technologies that humans have invented. It has become pervasive, like we cannot run our societies without computers and computation. And so AI, it's a way to make decisions or outsource decisions, which we have been doing for decades. I mean, people don't think about it, but Google is a form of AI. And it was built by students and researchers. When the two co-founders of Google were at Stanford, they were actually, being trained by one of the fathers of AI, Terry Winograd, who created an NLP system like in the 60s and 70s, right? So Google is an AI technology, but we have had time now to get used to it. And we know what it can do well and what it doesn't do well. And we have adjusted ourselves to it, but it is. And Google also has been using large language models, its own BERT and others, Roberta, over the past few years as part of Google search, right? It's not very well known, but actually one of the ways that Google has trying to improve over the past years is trying to understand your phrase, like query phrase better.
Right, yeah.
And I mean, initially, that is what these large language models were intended to do, right? Like instead of just looking for keywords as the prior version of Google used to do with like old informational retrieval techniques, now we moved into like, oh, there is some semantics there because I can understand the meaning and what you're searching. And as we know, Google also had its own large language models, Lambda, but it was just keeping it under wraps and not giving it to the public. So then OpenAI comes and it's like, oh, we're going to create technology that it's open and accessible, and we're going to put it out there. And they did this for a couple of years. On one hand, it's a good decision because not everybody is talking about this technology and everybody now knows about it. And a lot of people are concerned, which it's good. Like we need a healthy dose of concern because as with all new technologies, especially the ones that spread out so quickly, right, there are always going to be problems. So on one hand, it's good, but on the other hand, what's happening right now is that OpenAI noticed very quickly that it needs huge amount of capital in order to achieve these dreams of these wonderful models. And so then all these companies came in and invested billions of dollars. And so now this is not an open technology anymore. And OpenAI basically said, GPT-4, sorry, I'm not going to tell you anything about it, right? Because there are so many interests now in play. And so the problems now with all these new technologies, especially the ones that are better than others, is that we don't know what these people are going to do with them in terms of who do they give access to. But also the other part is that even if they put all these guardrails, etc., they themselves don't know the extent to which these technologies can be used, right? And so one thing that the public needs to be aware is that it's not that they intended ChatGPT or GPT-4 to be able to take the bar exam or to give you instructions for, how to build a bomb or how to renovate your house. Like, that was not the intention. That is something that just emerged out of this huge models that just can find the next word and the next.
I mean, it's so crazy when you think like, well, is this right? I mean, this is my understanding of it. It's like, that's really what it's doing. It's just like, it's completing your sentence or whatever, or a sentence, right? And it just kind of, it does that. And somehow that task is gotten, well, it's really interesting to just see the power of that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Right. And it just happened in, from the very first such models, like Word to Vec, maybe it was like 2013 or so, like in 10 years, like you went from some models that just can understand language to models that can generate language that completely, surpasses any imagination. And we don't know how it does it, right? So I want to connect this a little bit to the web, because one of the things that we don't talk about too much is the fact that, well, these large language models are trained on all human input that is available on the web, right? All our conversation, oral knowledge, and we all collectively have been inputting our knowledge on the web for decades now. We have done this willingly and freely and without being compensated, etc., right? Like, if you think of all people on Stack Overflow that are continuously answering questions, they're not doing this for any motivation. But what's happening right now is like OpenAI comes in, or Microsoft comes in and says like, oh yeah, we got all your knowledge, we built this amazing system, and now we're just going to use it to make money for ourselves, which is not very different from what Google did as well, right? Google also said like, oh yeah, the web is there. And yes, I'm going to give you a product that makes it very easy for you to find the things that you want, but I also want to make money out of this. And therefore, I'm going to just survey everything that you do so that I have enough data in order to put you, to get the advertisers to pay more, et cetera, right? So, and that's a fear, right? How these models are going to be used, both by the companies that own them, but also by the speculators, because one thing that is going to happen for sure is that we know that the first people who adopt these technologies are the ones who are, trying to benefit from an environment where there is still no regulations, where people are unaware of what's going on. If you remember the first years of emails, like spam reigned supreme, right? Like we just couldn't open our inbox yet. And the same for the web. Pre-Google, right, search engines were just showing spam results. And it took a significant effort to build tools that will prevent spam and scams and make, marginalize them. And the question is how it's going to happen and how quickly it's going to happen, because we as humans might become unwilling to continue to generate content for free on the internet, right? But at the same time, the people who see the value of cheaply generating text will dump a lot of that AI generated content on the web, and we know that it's not truthful, etc. So basically, there is this very great possibility that the quality of the web initially is going to get worse before maybe it starts improving again, but we don't know, right? We collectively have, as humans, might start thinking about like, maybe I just shouldn't be writing on Facebook any longer, or a blog post on Medium where ChatGPT goes, or GPT-4 goes and just absorbs my content and then spits it out as it's its own, right? Instead, we might all go to Discord and just have conversation there that are not being, recorded or indexed by these companies, or we might create other closed communities, and then the web becomes more fractured, more decentralized. Maybe it's a good thing, maybe not. We don't know, right? But there's going to be a lot of changes coming in order to sort of react to the introduction of these new models.
All right. Why don't we move to the last part of the podcast here? So we have our 3 questions that we like to ask everybody. So question number 1, Annie, what do you see as the biggest data gaps in the field? So places where you think this is a really important question, really important issue, but if only the data, were there, or we need to create it, right? Like, where do you sort of see that as being kind of most pressing?
So I'll stay with the web because, I study the web, and our both devices and the applications that we use are collecting a lot of raw data at the level of, milliseconds, right? Like whenever you scroll or move the mouse or type something, etc. So all this data is being collected and often is stored somewhere in some data dumps at Google or Facebook, etc. But there is very little value coming for us, the users of these technology, that it's coming from that data. I can see some change happening right now where, for example, the iPad will tell you like, oh, this week you spent like 2 hours less or more, right? But it's very vague, very high level. And I would love to see like an establishment of a data layer on top of the raw data. I mean, some people call it actionable, data, but basically aggregated actionable data that is people facing, right? So if we are spending so much time online, it would be actually really good to know what we're doing with our time online, right? Like, how come that after 2 hours, we don't know where our time went? Because, there is this addiction to technology, and the first step would be to have better data to understanding how humans are behaving and using technology. But this is not in the interest of the companies, right? Like TikTok or YouTube, they don't want you to be aware that you're spending so much time on TikTok. And so it had to come from somewhere else, right? Like probably open source software that a little bit like plugins, etc., that allow you, but they should be just more easy to use, right? And they should be embedded in our devices. So that is, I think, data that helps us understand our online behavior. I think that's a big miss. I think it's intentional, and hopefully it can change.
Question number 2. What excites you the most about the future of research?
Okay, so I'll try to say this briefly, but so you are aware of Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web. And Tim Berners-Lee, in the past few years, have come up with this new idea about like a decentralized web, where each of us own our own data. And there's a technology called data pods. And he created a company a couple of years ago. We probably should put in the notes like the URL, etc. because
sure.
Forget now. But
look down in the description, audience. It'll be down there.
Yes. But basically, so it's about having more control about over our data and about what we do on the web. Having no central repositories like Google and Facebook that are basically, extracting everything and then on top of it doing the surveillance capitalism thing, right? Instead, having many small providers which we trust, where we know we can have our data, and also having permissions for applications to use our data, etc. So at least in Europe, it seems that there is some action going toward this. I heard from a colleague that the Flanders government in Belgium, that it's like a regional government with like more than 6 million people, has teamed up with this company from Tim Berners-Lee in order to see how they can create an ecosystem for this data. Wow. It's very early, and of course it will need time to get traction, but it's a very exciting research direction.
All right, Annie, question number 3. If you could wave the magic wand, what would you change about, I guess in this case, the web?
The financing model.
Yeah.
Right.
Say more.
Well, so if we go back to another media, let's say the television and radio, from the beginning, from the start, they were 2 competing financing models. BBC, who is publicly funded, was actually created in 1922, so 100 years ago. And from the very beginning was this idea that, it belongs to the public, and we're going to use tax money, etc., to fund it. While in the United States, also in the early 20s, I think either NBC or CBC, one of the 2 big media corporation was created, but from the beginning with private investment and advertising, etc. And so we never had like a public funded web. We don't even know what that means, right? We don't know what it means for the government to had invested in their, search engines or social networks, etc. We have public libraries, but we don't have public online platforms. And it would have been interesting to see what the online ecosystem would have looked like if there had been different financing models. I mean, things have started changing a little bit. There is much more subscription now that it used to be the case. But initially, the ethos of the web was like, everything should be free and open, etc. But not anticipating how capitalism will basically just take over and then transform it into sort of an engine for making money at the expense of everybody else and our well-being, etc. So, yeah, it would have been interesting to see what public funding would have done for our information ecosystem.
Well, Annie, thank you so much. Really appreciate your making the time to chat about this stuff. It's really fascinating. Is there anything else you'd like to share?
So if there is, something that I would love to share, and I try to share often, is that if we see the online world as our shared environment, we should think about taking care of it the same way that we want to take care of our natural environment. Not that as humans, we have done a very good job at that, right? Like there is a lot of pollution and climate change, and all of these is because of our actions. But because we have this example of how we have failed in the past in taking care of shared environment spaces, then maybe that is something that we have to keep in mind, that the information and virus belongs to us all, and we all have a responsibility toward it to make it be a safe place and a healthy place, and finding ways to contribute to our online communities to sort of uphold the safety and health. That's a good goal to strive for.
I think that's great. And that's a great note to end on. So Annie, let me thank you again for joining us today. And thanks to our audience for tuning in. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe and leave a comment. And until next time.